ladies and gentlemen, esteemed speakers, a very, very warm welcome on this spring morning to the second edition of the Urban Land Institute's annual conference. As you've probably seen in the programme, my name is Katrina Sickle, and I'm going to be your moderator this morning. And I think it promises genuinely to be a morning really, really rich in debate, stimulating debate, that's going to take place under the theme, Building Great Cities, How Inclusivity Leads to Prosperity. So that really, really is the theme of today, and all the speakers know that. First things first, are your phones off, or at the very least on silent? Can you please check? That's very important. I mean, just a little poll. Who would actually be prepared to switch their phones right off? 100%. And just be here until 12:30. Phone frei. You would? Would you? Good for you. So would I. You're a star. I was actually thinking that the outcome would be nobody. Can you please ensure they're on silent? And if you do, we kindly ask that you exercise your thumbs just a little bit and tweet something productive and thought-provoking at some point during the day using hashtag ULI Belgium 2017. Let me take a quick read of the room. Forgive me, I'm British, so we have this pantomime tradition. So I'm going to make you work a bit, just a little bit at the outset, okay? Now you collectively embrace really quite a wide variety of sectors, so it's very helpful for your speakers today to know who they're talking to, not just a big clump of audience, but who are you in this audience, okay? So can I just ask, you might not all be here, I know that you were invited, local authorities, do we have any local authorities in the house? Yay! Okay, so do we have real estate developers? Raise your left hand. Left. Oh, so bad. Some people raise right. Oh, bad. Okay, real estate developers, they're mostly on that side. I don't know why. Freud would probably have something to say about that. Who represents the business sector? This is very wide, kind of, yeah. Yes, you do, for goodness sake. I mean, everyone's going to know that when you come up on stage, Mr. Colwaite. So you represent the business sector. Where are architects? Current and former? I know there are a few. Okay, there's definitely on the fringes. They don't want to be with the rest of you. Urban developers? We do have quite a few crossovers in this. Okay, and those representing civil society, let's say the community builders. Good, and my good self. So there we go, not bad. Finally, just so I know, thumbs up from the ULI members. Who is actually a member? Oh, good. Excellent. And who is not, but considering becoming a member? And is going to see and wait for the outcome. How cool is this event before they decide? Who's here with a view to thinking? Just the thank you very much for your honesty. Okay, so do you feel warm? Because I'm going to get you to clap later. So you need to exercise a little bit, and I'm glad we've started off. So I know who you are. Can I just briefly recap, just in 1 minute, on why we're here? Facts that you know, by 2030, more than 70% of the global population is going to be living in cities. So this makes urbanisation really one of the 21st century's most transformative trends. And as you all know from the work that you do, transformation is hugely exciting, but it's also hugely challenging. And it demands real vision and energy. We're going to hear from a gentleman who's had some vision and energy in just a moment to talk you through his own experience. Real vision and energy to create and to take advantage of opportunities. And it also demands persistence in overcoming obstacles and finding solutions to problems and pressing issues. And today, the focus is very, very much on transformation. We're going to explore together how to create cities that are attractive, competitive, and above all, inclusive. That is the theme. And ULI has gathered truly a veritable, what I call a smorgasbord of brains, okay? Some really cool people with very, very diverse experience from the public and the private sector to discuss this very wide-ranging topic. Now, you will get a chance to hear and to comment on the contributions of all our speakers in a series of presentations and interactive debates that are going to kick off shortly and close at around 12:45 because we started late. And you're going to have a refuel for coffee at 11. I think we've got a photographer. Do we have a photographer in the house today? No? Oh, so you're not going to be snapped. That's a first. Okay, we are being filmed, but we do have a journalist. Please stand, sir. Here is a very nice Scottish man. I know he's very nice and Scottish because I spoke to him before. He is going to put together a very eloquent summary okay, of the discussions this morning, and that means that he may approach you for a quote or two, so please do smile and don't run away in the other direction. He won't bite, all right? One quick rule before I hand over to the representatives of ULI Belgium and Europe to officially open today's event. I do have one rule that I ask you please to respect, and I think I've already terrified/traumatized some of my speakers as they were having their coffee. My job is to navigate us smoothly throughout the morning and stick to the schedule so that you all get out of here well before the cocktail hour. So, all speakers, really, please stick to your allotted timings, because I'd really like to give our audience a chance to raise their voices. And likewise, my dear audience, we do want to hear as many voices as possible. So if you have something to say, or you have a question for these good people, please keep it short and to the point, or I shall terminate with a very big and lovely smile. All right? Scared? No. Excited? Yeah. Excited? Yeah. Excited? Yay! Good, très bien. Je suis très très contente. Pardon, j'ai pas même dit en français pour les gens qui sont ici de la belle Belgique. Okay, and I'm sorry, my Flemish is pretty non-existent, so I apologise. And on that note, without further preamble, I would like to ask to come and join me on stage, please, to officially open today's conference, the CEO of ULI Europe, Lisette van Doren. Thank you very much. A real round of applause for this lady.
To the second ULI Belgium conference here in Brussels. We are very pleased to see so many of you here in this early morning already, right before you enter into a 2-3-day trade fair program, so there's much more from you that's being expected over the next few days. So we really appreciate you also took the time to come this morning. And we think it's going to be a very interesting morning, as already Trina slightly touched on that. Together with last night's dinner, which was wonderfully hosted by our chair, Belgian chair, Marnix Gal, and this conference, we think that spells out ULI from front to end. We are about networking and we are about content and knowledge sharing on thought-provoking themes and topics that matter. For those of you that don't know ULI, the Urban Land Institute, we are a global non-profit organization with more than 40,000 members all across the world, just over 3,000 members in Europe, and thanks to Marnix's inspiring leadership here in Belgium, we now have more than 200 members here in Belgium, achieved in a very short period of time. Our mission is to provide leadership on the responsible use of land and in building and sustaining thriving communities worldwide. More than ever, there's a focus on cities globally. Katrina already touched on urbanization. We see strong inflows of migrants to cities, especially here in Europe. And also investors are almost exclusively looking at cities. They leave countries almost completely to the side. Therefore, on a global scale, we think cities are more and more competing. But what does that mean for European cities? Last year, almost exactly a year ago, we looked at the competitiveness in that respect of Brussels and Antwerp and presented the results at the first ULI Belgium conference. What's clear for that is that for European cities, competition is not by size. We will never be able to compete by size, just like Chinese or American cities can. But what can we do? Key elements for European cities to compete successfully, we think, relate to innovation, livability, sustainability, and densifying, given that we see those strong inflows in cities, densifying cities in the right way. We all know how it went in the past and how we don't want it. But how do we get it right? And we think one of the key success factors for that relates to the right integration of migrants and creating mixed neighborhoods in cities. not only where people live, but also where they can work and, as we call it, play, where they can entertain themselves, having the right connectivity in place, but also mixed in the sense of different population groups, different income, different background. We need to go back to what we used to have, the neighborhood idea, long before we had cars. But the strong difference that now we have the connectivity, or need to create the connectivity. I can also do this. To be able to be connected to other cities and other neighborhoods as well. In that respect, ULI have just launched a report 2 weeks ago in Germany on mass migration. We feel that's an important topic for the real estate industry. And we looked at what the real estate industry is doing already or can do better to help the integration of migrants in Europe. And one of the key findings we found was that there's a strong disconnect now between the expertise on migration matters and the expertise on real estate. And those two, to successfully integrate people in cities, have not yet come together. And given today's theme of this conference, how inclusivity leads to prosperity, we think that's a key element. We need to better share the knowledge and collaborate, not only related to migrants, but also to the needs of different population groups. What do they need and what can it help us? How can it help us to build great cities? And therefore, I'm very much looking forward to this morning's program. I would encourage all of you to actively participate, share your views, ask your questions, and kind of let's all have a great debate. And now I'm very pleased to hand over to our chair for ULI Belgium, Marnik Skal. Thank you very much.
I'll just put it right up immediately. Good morning, Mrs. Secretary. Good morning, Mr. Murphy, our keynote speaker. Good morning, Mr. Adamovich, Mayor of Dansk, dear mayors, Belgium, aldermen, dear ULI members, and dear to-be ULI members. We're very happy to have you here, and we're exceedingly excited about having this thoughtful morning. I think it's essential for people of all walks of life involved in the large sense of our sector to be able to sit back in the morning and think about the present and the future and how we can make it better for us all. Welcome to the third richest region of Europe, because that's what the Brussels region is. After London West and after Luxembourg, Brussels region is the third richest region of Europe. Yet, at the same time that we have a huge quality, a huge pool of people, well qualified, who come into the city, who live in the city, who speak multi-languages, who provide real wealth and added value to this region, to Europe in general. We have great infrastructure, we have lots of things going for us. So this is the perfect society. Well, yet, no. At the same time, as those who can and those who want are able to move forward, we're leaving also an important group behind. I've checked this morning during breakfast the latest unemployment figures for Brussels, and I was quite impressed that they have been coming down tremendously over the last 3 years. I just hope we can believe statistics, but they have come down, but they're still at, for the adult population, 17%, and for young population, under 27, they're at 23, 24%. This is far too much. We're leaving too many people behind, and it is creating a social problem. It has been a social problem ever since the 70s, and basically ever since after war, when we started segregating our city and our region. But it's something that internationally, and also in Belgium, is coming to a boiling point. And this touches not only our sector, but it also touches humanity and our values, our Western liberal values at large. And I think it's, one, our civic role to address this, and two, it's just really better for us. It's better to be living in an inclusive society where everybody can live to the possibilities of his mobility, to have his social mobility, to have her social mobility, and to create into a general society. I think it's important that people who are left behind get social mobility in the sense of education, in the sense of having a real chance to have a go at it in life. In life, people like us wake up early, we go to sleep late at night, we work hard, and we're doers. And we basically have the tendency of thinking that everybody else in society has this same attitude, which a lot of people do if you give them a chance. So you must create this sort of entrepreneurialism through innovation, by the sharing economy, by innovation, etc., by giving micro loans, etc., etc. But at the same time, we must be realistic. There is also a pool of unemployed labor. There are people who simply are going to be delivering services at a lower level during the next cycles of life. And we must also include them very much into our program. So when I see how inclusivity leads to prosperity, it is such an evidence. It's an evidence to pull everybody together and to try, every country that you live in, every country that you come from, to pull people together and have a communal sense of values and a communal sense of going forward. Because when there is no hope, there basically is no life and there is nothing to look forward. And this hope we must try to instill to all. It's this hope that also will drive the real estate sector, the cities that you represent, to higher levels of well-being. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a reason why neither of you use the stairs? Are they just for me? Thank you very much. Thank you. Very interesting what you said. And I think perhaps because you were talking about giving people a chance and civic values and humanity, we're looking at prosperity really in the absolute widest sense of the word. We ain't parking it. We're not talking just about the economy and money. We mean in the widest sense of the word, without a shed. So thank you very much for that. I particularly liked your comment, I hope we can trust the statistics. I hope so too. I'm moderating on fake news next week, so that was very interesting to me to hear your comments. Okay, so thank you very much to both of you for very eloquently setting the scene and just reinforcing for all of you why we're here and what we want to discuss and the context for it. We've got this fabulous case study now to inspire us. Marnix just spoke of the gentleman I'm about to introduce. We are very, very lucky, genuinely, to have the former mayor of Pittsburgh in our midst to talk about the highs, the lows, of transforming what was a heavy industrial US city into a knowledge-based, more socially inclusive economy. Could you please, and you may use the stairs, sir, if you like, can you please give a very, very warm welcome to Tom Murphy, please? Thank you very much.
Can you hear me okay? Okay. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and I apologize I have to do this in English, and I'll make it much more difficult because I have a Pittsburgh accent and I talk very fast. So I apologize, but I am very enthused about this subject, and I'm honored that I was invited to talk to you about this. What I want to talk about really is intentionality, the choices that cities and individuals make about what they want to be. Your corporations and your companies that you work for, you have a strategy and you're intentional about what you want to become. Cities need to be the same thing because we are at an unprecedented moment in time when we are looking at changes that are fundamentally defining the rules. Rules that have governed cities for years and years and people are comfortable with don't count anymore. They're getting swept away by globalization about where we make things where they're sold, by climate change, by technological innovation, by demographics, and by finances, what choices governments make about how they're going to invest in the future or not, and about talent, where talent makes a decision to go. This is an example. I won't ask you to memorize this. This looks at a dozen American cities, and if you look at the first chart, you'll see most American cities lost over the last 20 years anywhere from 20 to 50% of their manufacturing jobs. But in the same period of time, cities have increased the jobs and technology jobs and research and in hospitals and universities, more than doubling. And so where a city like Baltimore had twice as many people working in manufacturing 20 years ago, now there's twice as many people working in technology jobs. Think about what that means, the sweep of that over 20 years in terms of a city, and it's happening all over the world. Those fundamental changes, and for those trying to hold on to what they were and what they had, they're going to get swept away. And that's what you saw in our elections, in effect, okay? And I mentioned demographics. There are people that look like me that have gray hair that are making different kind of choices in America about where they want to live. We had big suburbanization in America, and now baby boomers that we call ourselves, those sort of between 50 and 65, are want to live in cities. They want to live in walkable places. This is no secret to you, but it is for us a revolution taking place. Even more dramatically are our kids. Our kids at 24-year-old is 6 times less likely to own an automobile in America than their parents did at that age. Why is that? Because they don't care about automobiles. They care about mobility, about how you move around. European cities, by and large, have invested heavily in mobility. American cities have not. And cities that are beginning to separate themselves are cities that have made choices about how do you invest in mobility, whether it's transit or whether it's Uber or a host of other choices that you make, or better yet, walkable, bikeable cities are all issues of American cities that we had not invested in heavily and we are invested in now. So intentionality is about those kinds of choices. I can make a choice to invest money on a new 4-lane interstate highway, or I can make choices to invest in expanding mass transit. They're the kind of intentional choices cities need to make to be successful. And I'm going to mention a couple of American cities, because what we're beginning to see, I believe, in Europe and around the world, and certainly in the United States, are cities beginning to separate themselves, because they've been very intentional in a kind of investments they've made. And so Seattle and Minneapolis and Denver are 3 cities in America that have begun to, they're what I call buzz cities. They're cities that young people are flocking to. Seattle is where Microsoft and Amazon and Starbucks were all created, among other companies. What is it in the DNA in Seattle that they're that entrepreneurial? And we're talking about over the last 20 years or so. And Minneapolis is a city that's in the middle of the country. In the north, it's very cold. It's not near any oceans. But young people are flocking to that city because it has a great vibe to it. The same as Denver, Colorado, that invested heavily billions of dollars in a transit system and is driving billions of dollars of new development. Nashville, Tennessee. If you like country music, you know about Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville has been created, has not only gotten a buzz because of music, but because it's now a technology economy also. And Greenville, North Carolina is a small little city, 100,000 people in North Carolina, but it is where BMW has their factory and major research facility. It's a city that remade itself, and they created a buzz about themselves by building a vibrant, exciting downtown in a park. In Austin, Texas, also driven by music, but more than music, and technology also. And that brings us to Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is an unlikely city to be part of this conversation, because Pittsburgh was the economic basket case of America 20 years ago. Pittsburgh was the most economically depressed and one of the most environmentally degraded cities in America 25 years ago. You might know that The Economist magazine over the last several years now has ranked Pittsburgh as the most livable city in America. We don't even believe that, because the change for us has been so remarkable. Moving from a city that was environmentally degraded. This is our population. As you can see, we lost 500,000 people left Pittsburgh between 1970 and 1990. 50,000 people a year were leaving Pittsburgh. Can you imagine? And the people that were leaving were young people. We became the second oldest place in America. Miami's the oldest place, and it wasn't because people were retiring to Pittsburgh. We are in 600 miles from the ocean, and we have cold weather. So we're not very similar probably to Brussels in terms of our weather. So we're not an attractive place in that regard. And so when you lose 500,000 people, 20% of your population, all largely your young people, you have a reason to be concerned. And in fact, there were billboards in Pittsburgh that said, "The last person out, shut the lights off." How would you like that to be your slogan? So we were facing a very, very bleak future. And what we have now begun to see is that our population is going up dramatically. Our population is becoming younger. In fact, in the last 10 years, we've all become 4 years younger in Pittsburgh. Why? Because so many young people are now moving to our city. So it is a remarkable change, and we're seeing that millennial population. As you can see, we're outpacing the United States in terms of young people moving to the city. So how did we make this turnaround? I became mayor in 1994. As I mentioned, we were losing thousands of people a year, and our unemployment rate was about 18 to 20%. Very similar to what you are facing here. And so how did we make, what were the choices that we had to make? And this is intentional. And let me just say, I can talk about this and it sounds wonderful. This was very difficult, very controversial series of decisions that we made to break from our past and to move into an uncertain future, to become something other than what we were, to imagine a different kind of city. The first was, where were people going to work? The people that were leaving because they worked in steel mills, and we were the steel-making capital of America. 60% of the steel that came from the United States came from Pittsburgh, and then it didn't anymore. In 20 years, those steel jobs left. We lost 150,000 jobs in the steel industry alone in those 20 years. And so we have a lot of people leaving the region, and a lot of people there hoping that the steel mills might start up again. And we made a decision that we were going to have to think about where people were going to work in a different way. And we had really good universities, which I'll talk about in a minute, really great universities. And the president of one of those universities said, "We can be the economic engine of this region." And you know, the universities have been there for 100 years, and they hired people and they did research, but we never thought of them as driving an economy. And what does that mean? And what we came to realize is it meant that we needed to think about ourselves in a very different way. We had we were a city of big unions and big corporations, and we needed to think about how do we become an entrepreneurial city? How do we support people that want to start companies? And the university president says, you know, we're graduating all these people from Carnegie Mellon University or the University of Pittsburgh. If they want to commercialize an idea, they leave Pittsburgh. They go to Silicon Valley or they go to Boston because there's no support for them here. There's no venture capital. And so we had thought about it. We needed to build a whole new infrastructure based on technology, not based on our traditional industries. The second was we needed to create that entrepreneurial culture. We needed to be a city that would embrace risk-taking, would support people excuse me, that want to invest want to start companies and needed money to start companies and needed a support system to make that company work. We did not have any of that. So we had to build that entrepreneurial culture. It's a different kind of infrastructure than an infrastructure that's necessary for traditional industries. Education was everything, and we, you know, when you worked in a steel mill, you didn't need a high school education. In fact, 20 years ago, we were the lowest, we had the lowest percentage of high school graduates of any major city in America 20 years ago. Last year, we had the second highest high school graduation rates of any city in America. And so we have remarkably changed our trajectory in terms of how we focus, because without education, without a commitment to education, your population is not going to be successful. And the other is vibrancy. You know, that people want to live in exciting places. I'm in Europe, so I'm intimidated about talking about that. Every one of your cities are great cities, but young people particularly want to live where there's great culture and arts and recreation. And you need to think about how you invest in those, and I'll talk about that. The other is land use. You know, I was one of the ministers up on this beautiful overlook on the canal last night, and she said, you know, we'd love to do more development here, we don't have the land. And I'm looking at all this industrial property along that, and I said, you have the land. It's just a question of how you get it back into productive, more sort of the new uses that you need. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, and I'm very specific. So when we said we're going to partner with the university, we as a city financed buildings on the university campus for companies like Google and Microsoft and Amazon and General Electric to do research in. And that was a partnership with the university. So part of what you're going to hear about is intentionality. The other word I want to underline is partnership, because everything that we did was in partners with the private sector or with the universities. I want you to understand that is that we were investing public money with private money to make things happen, as long as our views, our visions coincided. This is an example where we invested with the university to anchor companies doing research at the university. So this is an example. Google started just 10 years ago in that new building you saw with just 2 people. They now have 600 people in Pittsburgh, and they took over an old Nabisco bakery building. That looks like one of the buildings across the way from you, man. All right. They took over that old abandoned Nabisco bakery. It was an old bakery, and that now has 600 Google employees working on artificial intelligence. That's where Google wants to locate. They don't want one of those fancy glass office buildings in downtown. And around that whole development now has become major retail, so it's a mixed-use development. There's also residential. If you come to Pittsburgh, you're going to see the future. You're going to see 150 driverless Uber cars on the street. Are you ready for that? So I can get an Uber and nobody's driving it. Think about the implications that has. I had this funny experience. I was leading a bike tour in Pittsburgh, and we came to an intersection just as an Uber driverless car came to the intersection. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was looking at a bear. The first time in my life, I felt like this machine was looking at me, deciding what I was going to do. And it waited for us to go, to commit ourselves, and then it went on its way. So get ready, it is coming, and the implications across work, how we manufacture things, how we do lots of stuff, will be impacted by artificial intelligence. And this is very visually, we are reminded every day in Pittsburgh as we see these cars drive around on the streets. And what is driving this? This is the investment in research worldwide. This is what, so you can see the big blue is the United States, where we invest about $400 billion a year in basic research. Out of this research comes the new ideas, the commercialization. This is the investment in venture capital in the United States. And I can tell you, without you having to look at it, the top 3, San Francisco, San Jose, and Boston, get almost 70% of the venture capital invested in America or invested in 3 places. You know the story of Mark Zuckerberg? He had an idea while he was a student at Harvard in Boston, and his friend said, if you want to grow this idea, you need to move to California. Because that's where the money is, and he moved Facebook, and Boston has an inferiority complex because they have started programs so they don't lose the next Mark Zuckerberg. But that is in part what is happening in many places around the world, is that you are educating your best and brightest. They come up with ideas and they look for investments, money, venture capital to invest, to move that idea into commercialization, and often they leave and move to where the venture capitalists are. So you need to examine that in each country. So these are venture capital investments. We started with no venture capital available in Pittsburgh, and could rattle off a dozen companies that have started all around the United States that had left. The founders of the companies had been educated in Pittsburgh, in many cases grew up in Pittsburgh, and then left because we were not supporting their efforts. And you can see now we are generating anywhere from 30 or 40 companies, new startup companies a year in Pittsburgh. So over a 10-year period, that is now equaling hundreds and hundreds of companies. Some have grown to be hugely successful. And what has also happened is that now companies like Google and General Electric and Amazon and Microsoft have all brought hundreds of people to Pittsburgh to work because of the kind of technology being developed at the universities. As you can see, the University of Pittsburgh gets almost $800 million a year in research. And Carnegie Mellon University, $250 million a year in research. So every year, $1 billion in research is being invested in Pittsburgh. And out of that is, how do you create commercialization? How do you identify the promising young students or professors that have come up with ideas that can get commercialized? That is the focus that we took. That was how we were going to create work. And we were focusing our educational system on how we educate people to get those kinds of jobs. And this is over the last 15 years, partnerships we have formed with private businesses. So we had thousands of acres of old steel mills. The steel mills were abandoned, and we could look at them for the rest of our lives, or we made a decision to do something other than just look at them. And so we developed a vision of what ought to happen. We bought them as a government. We bought the steel mills. We went out into the marketplace and partnered with private developers. And if you came to us and said, we want to build housing or commercial or office buildings, but I'm not sure that I have enough, there's too big of a risk. I'm not sure I'm willing to risk my capital. I don't know if I'll get the return. We would be willing to invest with you, public money, and we would take that risk. So when I was mayor, developers would come and say, Mayor, I have a great idea for you. And I'd say, with all due respect, you tell me why it's a great idea for you, and we'll decide whether it's a great idea for us. And if our self-interests coincide, we'll figure out how to make a deal. That assumed we knew what we wanted. And most cities, a lot of cities don't know what they want. They sort of are reactive. But if we knew this is the kind of quality we wanted, this is what we wanted to build, then we would partner with you, and we would say, if you hit a certain benchmark in rents or square foot, what you were getting for your development, then you start to pay us back. If you don't hit that, you don't need to pay us back. We were willing to take the risk. This is a report over 15 years that shows we put $338 million of public money into deals. We've gotten it all back, and it's generated $3 billion of private investment over a 10-year period. We were able to get that with that kind of public-private partnership of sharing a risk and sharing a vision of what kind of city we wanted to have. This is the change I mentioned in education. So as you can see, we had a significant increase in graduations from high school and college graduates. One of the things we did, and this was raised by the private business, is it is expensive to go to universities or after high school. It's expensive in America to go to school. Our business leadership in Pittsburgh have raised $250 million, and any child that graduates from the Pittsburgh Public School with a B average and good attendance gets a $30,000 scholarship to go whatever school they want to go to. So the story in many places in America that I can't afford to get a further education is not true in Pittsburgh, because our community's made a decision, and this is an example. Community college is a normal 2-year technical college right out of high school. You can see the number of people, one in 3 county residents out of 1.5 million people have gone to community college. So we moved from a city that had no value in education, very low high school graduation rates, let alone to a city that valued education over a 25-year period. It made huge investments in how to help people get to education. And so this is what we call the Pittsburgh Promise. You can look it up, and you can see that the number of students that we have now given almost $50 million of scholarships to those students who are, and this is again funded by the business leadership of Pittsburgh, not by government. ULI has published a recent book. I was co-author of it, booklet. It's about 60 pages that talks about how some of this creative financing that you might want to look at. We look at 6 case studies. Pittsburgh's one of them, and others. So I mentioned that we invested. We were a city that did not have good cultural background, and we weren't investing in that, and we were losing population. Our budget was going down, and there was not a lot of money to invest in that. So we made a big decision to invest, to raise our taxes on ourselves and create what we call a regional asset district, in which we invested $80 million a year in what we call our regional assets, in the symphony, in the ballet, and parks, and the libraries. So even as we were declining, we felt that we needed to make big investments. That was controversial. You know, people said, you're raising the taxes, I'm going to move somewhere else. I don't want to pay higher taxes. It was a .5 cent sales tax. It wasn't a big deal, but it was a decision that we made as a community. We invested heavily in our riverfronts. We have lots of riverfronts in Pittsburgh, and we created great parks, and actually a 30-mile continuous park. For those of you who are, I was talking last night, bike riders, the best bike ride in America is from Pittsburgh to Washington, D.C. It's about 345 miles, 60 miles a day. It's on an old railroad right away. It's completely off the road. It's a complete bike trail the whole way. Beautiful ride, lots of history. If you have a question about it, let me know. This was the steel mills that we had. So when I'm becoming mayor, we had all these steel mills, thousands of acres. My father worked in the steel mill for 51 years. And when I became mayor, I directed our redevelopment agency to buy it. It was about 120 acres. And where 10,000 men and women made steel, there's now a cheesecake factory. He would shoot me if he were alive. So now there, and this is the example. You can see this is a 120-acre development we did. It's a mixed use of housing, residential. But what I want you to notice is that it's a public-private partnership. That's about $800 million of development there, and about $130 million of it is public money that we needed to invest to get private developers interested in being our partner and building the kind of quality we wanted there. And so these are the pieces of the puzzle. And in some ways, there are no secrets. It is the questions of whether you have the leadership to make it happen. You need to know where you want to go. If any of you have been to New York and you see the High Line, 90% of the people in New York thought that was a liability. It was an old railroad trestle running down through the west side of Manhattan for 30 years, sitting there vacant. Some young people saw it differently, and they convinced the mayor to think about it as a park. Who could have imagined a trestle 30 feet in the air being one of the most spectacular places in New York City? It is a remarkable example of how people thought about their city differently. It's about a strategy. It's always about leadership. It is so much easier to go with the flow. It is so much more difficult to say, we're going to imagine a different kind of place. And to go. and to go there. And people that have a stake in the old place don't want to change. And so when we were talking about redoing the old steel mills, all the steel workers and all the people that connected to steel picketed me because they wanted to get the old steel mills back. And our view was that they were gone and they were never coming back and we needed to move on. And that is a hard decision to have, and it's a hard conversation to have with people. I mentioned partnerships, and I'll talk about partnerships over and over again. The key to this is having not a them and us, or having a government that sets up a series of bureaucratic rules, though your attorneys might like that, it is understanding how you share a common vision and how you make that happen in a timely kind of way, not taking years to get approvals and making it happen. So what do all these companies have in common? General Electric and Motorola and Marriott and GE, and I'll add Caterpillar and Kraft. What do they all have in common? In the last 3 years, they've all moved their headquarters from suburban developments, really very. General Electric moved from a 74-acre campus in rural Connecticut into downtown Boston. They've all moved their headquarters into cities. And why are they doing that? Because they're chasing the talent. Because talent wants to live in vibrant, exciting, walkable places. They don't want to have to spend an hour getting on the transit or driving to get to work every day. And so we're seeing, for the first time maybe in history, where always before people would move to where the jobs are, increasingly we're beginning to see jobs move where people are because they're chasing the talent. And the other is about how you build your places, and we've all committed this sin. So this is at the entrance of the University of Pittsburgh, a university that has 20,000 people that go to it every day. And this is the front door. And what was the highest and best use of that property? A surface parking lot for 30 years. And so we said, why are we doing that? It's like if I drove into your city, if I drove into Brussels, and you have a sign from the airport, and you would say, welcome to Brussels, we are a green city, we're a world-class city, you would never think to say, welcome to Brussels, we're a mediocre city, would you? But that's what you do when you build, if you don't build really well, if you don't build great places. And so 600 people were really mad at me because we said we're taking the parking out and we put a park in. You know, and people said, what good is a park? It's cold 6 months of the year in Pittsburgh, but you know, it's filled with hundreds of people hanging out there. There's a restaurant there, and it's like, and I see that in Brussels. I'm a runner, and every day I've been here, I went for a run, and I see thousands of people sitting in little parklets and everything. They are so important to creating the sense of place, of where a great place is. So you have a choice. You have a choice about being a city that reaches for the future or a city that rests on its past. That's a choice that every city faces in the world. Every city is trying to find a place in the world because the world and the rules that are governing cities have gotten turned upside down. How cities make those choices will be the determining factor of whether the city is successful or not. And what I found when I was mayor is, you know, I could go to 1,000 meetings, and every meeting I went to, there were at least 100 people giving me a reason why I can't do it, why we couldn't do what we were suggesting. And they get to define the agenda, or you sort of say, we'll listen respectfully, and we'll take some of your ideas, but we're going to reach for the future. We're going to imagine a different kind of place. Brussels needs to do that. You need to build on this spectacular history and architecture you have, but you need to understand how to partner with your universities. You need to understand how to engage your young people in education. And all that means reimagining a different kind of way of doing business. I challenge you to do that. Don't be comfortable. Reach for the future. Good luck.
I'll sit there, you can sit there, just because we have 10 minutes. I like that reach for the future. You sound like, not Buzz Lightyear. No, Buzz Lightyear. That's much more exciting than Bill Clinton. Thank you very, very much. And I particularly love the idea of you reinforcing that it's really kind of good to be not necessarily liked, because it's far too easy to sit back on your backside. So you have to just accept if you're picketed and if you get lots of angry people with pitchforks saying we don't want change, that is part of the process. I just want to pick up on a few elements you said and then open it to these good people for 10 minutes. One of them also to bring it to the socially inclusive aspect also, and to just reinforce. What was very interesting, there were lots of things that you spoke about. I like the idea of risk-taking. You talked about creative financing, the public and private sector, the value of R&D. And you spoke about how business was supporting scholarships. So can you give examples of ways in which social inclusivity was at the core of some of those very difficult decisions you took? If that is, where you saw that in your city. And I think how do you, a very interesting question when I heard Marnix at the outset, this level of respect for multiculturalism, all kinds of different populations, classes, people have earned different amounts of money. Does that come with the integration, or does it need to be before? What examples could you talk to us?
It's a thread that ran through every one of those 6 things. So let me give you a real estate example. The city of Pittsburgh owns 17,000 units of what you would know as social housing. So if the very lowest income people in Pittsburgh live in those 17,000 units, almost 30,000 people live in those. The first thing I did when I became mayor was to make myself chairman of that, because that social housing was very isolated. It was big development, 1,700 units is one example. It had its own psychology. It was very disruptive. And we made a decision that we were going to change that, and so we demolished thousands of units and rebuilt mixed income communities, which is very controversial.
And presumably from the ground up, you engaged the people living there.
I had chairs thrown at me.
Yeah,
and,
right. But they were part of the process of decision making.
Because they did not trust. They thought we were going to tear the houses they had lived in some cases for several generations, and make them live under a tree. They didn't believe that we would ever do anything better for them. And so we had to develop that level of trust. And when we did, and we began to demolish the units and build new ones, then we had other people in other social housing developments, saying, can we be next? So once people understood that there was a light at the end of the tunnel and it wasn't just going to be, and so there was the whole effort to build relationships and hope. It really is the issue of hope, okay, of how you give people a sense. Part of that conversation is that people that would move into the new units were moving forward in one way. They were in school. We also then worked very closely with private businesses. So several of our banks, for example, were building major operations centers in the city that we had worked with to have them built in the city. So we're talking about almost 6,000 jobs. And we built a very focused training program from people living in social housing to those jobs in terms of training. We did the early recruiting for testing for drugs, and did put them into training, and through a 2-year process. In the
so that mixed social housing was in a way part of a very holistic approach.
It was very holistic, and it was same with the hospitals and the universities. So for every PhD researcher at the universities, probably anywhere from 10 to 15 jobs connected to that person. So we were very focused on getting the research, so that's driving the jobs. But then the other kind of jobs, what are the qualifications? Some of those jobs require just a year or two education beyond high school. And so we were very focused on, one, creating the jobs, and then two, creating a pathway to those jobs for people that would be typically excluded from the opportunities of those jobs. Understand, at the end of the day, people need to make a choice. It's an individual choice whether they're going to value education. because these jobs increasingly are going to require some level of education beyond high school.
Okay, so I think, you know, it's very clear that from what you say, it requires dynamism and communication, just relentless communication, which is what takes the energy. But I don't want to hoover up all of your time. Is there one or two questions on something that Tom has spoken about, or something he hasn't touched on? And yes, the gentleman here, hang on just a second. We have a lovely hostess with a tie who's coming. And you need to hold it quite close. And obviously, if you can kindly say who you are and where you're from. Thank you.
My name is Alexander Lamont. You mentioned quite a few success factors, pieces of the puzzles, as you mentioned. Two of them may not have been specifically mentioned. One of them is money. How much money was required for this? How much was it in issue? Did you have to borrow, and did you have to take risks as a public authority on the money side? The second one is political system. Did you as a mayor have authority to carry out all your policies, or were there other political stakeholders that would have made it difficult for you? The reason I've mentioned these two particular points is that in Belgium and maybe other cities, public authorities would claim that there's
That's not the way you're talking, is it? That's the microphone.
microphone. Sorry.
No, I get the questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they're two of the most difficult issues. So
Can I just before
Yeah.
we hold, is there anybody who's got a different, just so that Tom knows, anybody who wants to go into a different area, has a different kind of question? We're looking at money and economics, and absolutely who are the stakeholders who are there and have to be taken into account more in the political sense. Anybody else? We are staring out into the, it's like being at the Super Bowl. Okay, so there we go.
Okay, so in the money, let me start with the money. So Pittsburgh's flat broke. We've lost half of our population, have left. And so we are as flat broke as any city in America, but we have money. So when the government says, we'd love to do this, but we don't have money, they have money. It's a question of priorities, and the priorities in most governments are today, which means I'm spending all my money in America on police, and public safety, and paving roads, and getting snow off the street. And cities need to think about how they carve out some of those resources to invest in the future. So one of the first hard decisions I did is I cut the city's workforce by almost 200 people, including the police. Now, in America, you take a big risk reducing the number of police officers you have. And actually, our crime rate went down. So I said to the my police chief thinking, what if we reduce it another couple hundred, what happens? He said, you can't do that, okay? Anyhow, and we took $6 million a year out of our operating budget and created a $60 million development fund, which we controlled as a city, did not have to rely on the federal government or the state government, and we used it to invest in some of the deals that I talked about. The second thing we have, and I don't know that if you have the equivalent, we have what we call tax increment financing. So if there's a vacant steel mill that's producing 1,000, it's vacant, it's sitting there vacant, it's generating $1,000 a year in property taxes. And now we partner with the developer, and the developer's going to build all these buildings on it, and it's going to generate $10,000 in property taxes. That $9,000 is the increment, and we can borrow against that. Meaning that we can pledge to use that $9,000 to finance the bond issue today, to do the infrastructure, to put in parks, to invest in the development, and then as the developer builds the buildings out, we get the property taxes we've divert to paying back that bond issue. We don't get the property taxes for 15 or 20 years. So we use different forms of creative financing. It was not unusual for us to have 8 to 10 different sources of financing in one deal with a private developer. Our goal, so we saw ourselves as public entrepreneurs, is that if you're a developer wanting to do something, we're going to partner with you. Let me go to the second question. The second question is always the issue. And I was largely at war for the 12 years I was mayor with the other politicians.
You're looking good on it, sir.
Because they were more focused on the status quo. And so And so I was always, we have 9 council people in Pittsburgh, so I was always able to get 5 votes to get whatever we wanted it done. But understand that the state legislature we had and other political people, it was hand-to-hand combat every day. Because it is so much easier to protect the status quo than it is to jump off the cliff into the future, not knowing what the risks are going to be. When we buy, the first 18 months we were mayor, when I was mayor, I directed our development agency to buy almost 2,000 acres of land. We were hopeful that we could develop that, but we weren't sure. If anybody, think about a city that's lost half of its population, we're not high on the radar of a lot of developers as a great market. And so the results were impressive. We were able to develop them, but they are the big risk. And so I mean, we had some failures. I don't want to make this sound like we hit a home run every time. You probably don't understand that analogy. It's a baseball analogy.
Home runs, I think. Baseball is take.
Yeah.
We're good. But just to say, you say an important point there, and only just because I'm conscious of time, you say an important point that there's evidence. I mean, the minute you start to show evidence off the back of those things, you're going to get less naysayers. You're going to be pelted less every day. You're going to go less into a war zone. The more evidence you provide, the more you can, calm those who have these fears of the status quo. Well, indeed. I mean, I find it remarkable that the transformation is just 20 years, to be honest. Okay, so just to conclude, and then I'm going to see if we have any more questions. And did you want to?
Just let me give you one really quick example. For reasons I won't go into, we make a decision to build a new baseball park, a new football stadium, and a new convention center. Again, we're a flat broke city. We make a decision to build these 3. They're going to cost about $1.5 billion. We go to the voters and ask them to approve raising the sales tax, and 70% of them voted against it. 70%. A month later, I stood up with 2 partners, other politicians, neither of them ever ran for office again, and said, we're going to do this anyhow and build these 3 things without raising the sales tax, but financing it in other ways. You can imagine how popular I was when 70% of the people had voted against it. Now they've generated $1.5 billion of new development around it. And if you went to Pittsburgh and said, how many of you voted against building these things, nobody would admit to it, okay? But it was that risk that we took. I did win 2 elections after that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All good before I release this gentleman? You're here for the day?
Yeah,
You're here until lunch? Okay, so a warm round of applause, please. Thank you very, very much. Right, I'm now going to invite to the stage. We're going to go straight into a panel debate. We're going to hear from 3 very interesting perspectives. And don't forget that just actually before we stop for lunch, we have 2 other mayors. So I'll be very curious to hear from those 2 mayors and what their dynamic is and some of the challenges that you are tackling. So, can I please invite to the stage Jürgen Bruns-Berentelg, CEO of Hafen City. Where are you? And I'm very sorry if I did a very non-BBC pronunciation. In fact, you should be here, and I need to go over there. Can I also ask for Serge Fautret, the CEO of AG Real Estate Belgium? You may use the stairs, you may leap onto the stage like a gazelle, whichever you prefer. You leapt. Ooh. And can I please ask Pete Colroyd, co-founder of the SI2 Fund, to come to the stage. You can even clap them to make them feel. So many elements there, doubtless, that also permeate your own approaches and your own experiences, but we'll find out in a minute. We've heard how one city has done it. I'm very curious to see how we can apply that model to Europe. I mean, Tom kindly said what fabulous cities and how stuffed full of culture it is, but doubtless there is much of a flip side to that. So we've got a lot of sectoral representatives here, and I think they're going to be itching to find out the market's response to some of those key components that were touched on, sort of the grid density, the livability, the spaces, perhaps the mindfulness, which our speaker this afternoon is going to touch on. So broadly, we're looking at the city perspective, the sectoral perspective, the investor perspective, okay? Just literally, in a nutshell, 1 minute, What did you hear from there that you go, ah, yeah, you were nodding your head, or something that, ooh, interesting that. I'd like to get your initial response to Tom's keynote.
In general, I'm impressed by the agility of American mayors to deal with problems. I think we are doing it politically in a more ordered, so to say, sometimes I might even say more bureaucratic way, in the tradition of European welfare states, at least in Germany or in Scandinavian countries. So I think we can take very much, so to say, this perspective of an entrepreneurial city to combine that with the welfare aspects of urban development.
Okay, yes, Pete.
For me, it was also very impressive to hear this story about Pittsburgh. What I remember, or the takeaway, is the investment in at long term, with a long-term view, investment that could have social benefits in the long term will also have financial benefits, and so also the fact that the mayor said that they had to take risks to do that. So it's not easy. It's not a walk in the park. I think as an investor, I always say there is a difference between social impact investing and finance first impact investing. I think the difference is that people have to have another balance of risk return, and you have to take some risk to have this financial and societal benefit.
Okay, yes, Serge.
Well, first, Marnix, I would like to thank you to have invited Mr. Murphy. I think we in the audience can only be a little bit jealous of the city of Pittsburgh. When can we have leaders who can say that Brussels has positive demographics, that we have great universities, that we have, or that we will have, a vibrant city center, that we have fantastic museums, that we have some of the world's best surgeons, that we are actually a very green city. So what I regret is that they probably be not in the room this morning, more public authorities, more politicians who would listen how a city like Pittsburgh is selling itself. On the other hand, don't ask what the public sector can do to you, but ask what you can do with the public sector, and it is our duty, probably as investor, as developer, or as organizations like ULI, like the Belgian Property Federation, to try and share with the politicians what we hear and how we would like, with the public authorities, to shape the future. Because we need Uncle Sam, we need Uncle Ivan, we need Uncle Rudy, we need you to be here and to listen to what is done abroad. We don't listen enough to what is done in foreign cities. So thank you, Marnix.
Thank you. And I like that. I think you've made a very important emphasis. Yeah, it's about, you said yourself, don't also accept the status quo, be the multiplier, go that way and spread the word. If they're not here, go that way. So, I'm going to come back to you, sir, and there's a very specific question I'm going to ask you. I don't know if you've all read the programme, but Hafen City Hamburg is a public company and is owned by the city-state of Hamburg, and it represents mixed-use 40% expansion of the core city area of Hamburg, reuse of banks for housing. You've got the generation of 10.5 kilometres of new public waterfront. So it's a really successful example, we can say, of social inclusion. I think the obvious question for you is how can you translate inclusion into the real estate strategy? And you've told me at the heart of it is diversity. So how do you actually do it? What are the nuts and bolts behind your big vision? How did you get there?
Well, first we take a little bit of time for the transformation, because if you try to do it too fast, you lose in terms of quality. Second general comment, it is a very strong mixed-use project. Hafen City has 45,000 jobs to be developed, university spaces, naturally housing, 7,000 units, cultural buildings, and a lot more, and public spaces, retail, and so on. So it's really a mixed-use urban environment which is to be developed. But within this picture, general picture. There is this specific strategy to develop, for example, housing, to make that inclusive, because in such a big project in the city center, there is an enormous trend to develop basically new build gentrification, not pushing out people, but being very highly selective. And I think we have found a number of rules to avoid that. The first thing is we have basically developed a strategy to diversify our builders and owners of buildings, to come up with a higher diversity of those than which represent the core of the market and the normal risk takers. So changing the size of the developments and so on makes the risk more acceptable for smaller ones and even for more innovative ones. Secondly, what we are doing, we look at the whole spread of different types of housing, not only adding affordable housing, but community housing, for example, but owner-occupied residence, leaseholds, and so on. So actually, you would have a community of people in the area of the city which represent probably 80% of the people in the city. Because it is new build, it will to a certain degree remain to be selective. Thirdly, we integrate social institutions in our process ourselves. So we ask, so to say, specific social institutions working for elderly people, working for disabled people, working for children which have no parents anymore, and so on, to be part of the tendering process, of the public tendering process, and joining together with those developer builders and become an integrative part. Some maybe only a group of people, 16 or 20, living in a big house. Others may occupy part of a house, for example, disabled, ill young persons having multiple sclerosis and other major deficiency, coming to a place which is specifically built for them. And we do that, fourthly, in a fine-grained mixture of uses. Although we build big buildings, we basically make them fine-grained. So we have 3-4 types of, so to say, housing, sometimes in one building. So a 40,000 square meter house may have one use, but if it has 10 or 15 or 20,000, it will have 3 or 4 different types of housing. And developers and investors know that's far more difficult to come up with a solution than. So it's the encounter capacity of people joining, so to say, in a building that is actually an important element in the social integration of people. And what we are doing is we are not building the same types of housing in terms of a cluster, but we diversify also streets, not only buildings. So you can see that the building next to another building is never an affordable housing building, it is never in a luxury condominium, it is, so to say, community building, it is, so to say, a church-related building, and walking down the street will show you the different types of potential users. But they are all tenant blind, high architectural standard, so you cannot basically stigmatize one type of user by looking at the architecture. So we have architectural competition doing that and so on. And finally, 2 points beyond building, actually we are trying to develop, so to say, community institutional infrastructure of self-organization of people. So they have been building communities like for themselves. They have been building, so to say, groups which are servicing parks, groups which are servicing, for example, migrants moving into Hafen City. So this self-organization is an important part of generating inclusiveness in the city. And these are part of the strategic elements in the city center, because the city center is, in contrast to what Tom Murphy said, already a very high value place. And so we have to diversify economically down, not to raise the money, but basically to come down with the prices, and by the pricing strategy also support this diversification process to make the place inclusive.
Very interesting. You make many good points. I won't reflect back quite yet all of it because I'd like to hear from the other gentlemen, but very interesting in particular, I like particularly that high architecture and very important things from the outside that one cannot stigmatise, but particularly, and that might be something that you could come on here, that the difficulty, you know, for investors and for developers if you're doing 3 or 4 types of housing in one building, which is very key to social inclusion, but can present challenges. So, you are very passionate about this, I can see, it's fabulous, and I like what you say about looking outwards. Can we have a look from the real estate perspective, the challenges for you, some of the ways that you can be creative and forward-thinking, future-grabbing, as Tom said. Any sort of concrete actions that a real estate player can take to boost inclusivity and make an urban zone vibrant and prosperous, not just economically, but prosperous in the widest sense of the word? What are the typical challenges, what are the solutions you've found?
The challenge, I think, is one social dimension that we witness, which is loneliness. I'm not going to ask for a show of hand of who was alone last night, but we witness, I mean, clearly, loneliness of people that has to be addressed in all real estate aspects. I like a US company that has now reached $18 billion of market capitalization, that is WeWork. In reality, what they do is they try to address this issue of loneliness. WeWork is, you know, how to make people liaise to each other in their work environment. But moving from WeWork, you move to WeLive. How do you build housing projects where people are not alone in their stupid 40,000 square meters apartment with a TV screen and an iPhone and an iPad? The difficulty in that segment is size. We owned 4 towers in New York, we only own 2 now, but they are each roughly 700 apartments. In those 700 apartments, you can build common TV rooms, common meeting rooms, common health club in a Brussels residential complex. It is a lot more difficult, but we need to address that issue. How to make people move out of a 40 square meter apartment. We shop. We cannot let our shopping centers be what they were 20 years ago. They need to be places where people meet before shopping. Otherwise, you know, the only thing is going in the wallet of your client. So we shop is the same thing. We age. People are alone when they age. My mother is on the phone with me nearly every morning, and she said, "Well, Serge, I'm alone." Very difficult to tell her, you know, move to an assisted living or to an area where there are a little bit more older people, but we need to address that issue. So we age, and we've developed very few of those projects in Belgium. One of them is a project by a new ULI member, Bella Vita, where people have common libraries. They go together, they move to Paris, together they go to an exposition. Same thing, because I don't want to take the whole conversation, but it's, we learn and we grow. I mean, the crèche, I don't know how you say that in Kribben, in Flemish, I mean, where people nursery places. You know, Orwell was right when he said about Big Brother. He was right when he wrote about Animal Farm. You know, we need the majority of all little babies are done now. When they grow 3 years old, they go to, you know, they, in order not to be alone, they grow in those cases. So that is the real estate, I think, has a major duty in trying to break in every single aspect of its segments, to break this element of loneliness. The biggest suicide ratio in Brussels is among European civil servants. They live alone, away from their family. It's stupid.
I think that's very interesting in terms of, and what, hugely interesting, because behind that, I'll come to Pete first before I ask, but it's how do you also change mindsets? How do you get society as a whole to embrace that different kind of living? And I think that's very, very key. If we're talking about people leaving those flats, it's the things we are in touch with, the things we're used to. So we'll come to that, but I'm just going to come to you, Pete, if I may, be very specific in terms of the perspective that you're going to bring. I mean, you did raise your hand, you started your career as an architect, but more recently you founded Impact Capital, I think it was 2012, and co-founded the SI2 Fund. So this is all about sustainable investments, and Revive, a company that engages in development schemes, financing, project management of abandoned and underused sites for real estate and industries. I mean, how do you see, you know, we've looked at addressing loneliness, we've looked at non-stigmatizing and fantastic, this self-creation of those areas, so that it's very holistic of the groups that live there. What do you see as the value of social entrepreneurship, you know, in a city, in terms of integration and cohesion? And can you give us a sort of a general view on that, and then any kind of concrete examples from your career and your experience?
So again, although I'm a Belgian with a brick in my stomach, and I'm an architect, I will talk a bit more than only real estate. Our baseline with Revive is we build society, not real estate.
Right.
So it's really about having impact in a positive sense, of course, because the war has also some impact. So having positive societal impact, and we start from challenges, and if you look at the big challenges in our society today, like climate change, there is people getting older, aging, and employment, poverty in Belgium still 16% is below the poverty threshold. So there are many challenges, and if you look well, although I will not really focus on one of them, they all come together in cities. So I think, also being an architect, that building the environment, it can also change the mindsets. So one of the examples where we invested in, so within SI2 Fund, so impact investing means trying to combine doing good and doing well. So there is a societal challenge. If you can find a solution to it with a business model, not only with subsidies, with a business model, then it's also a growth market. So that's really an opportunity. So that's what we want to do, and look for solutions for big societal issues. One example, so everyone knows e-commerce is going up, and more empty white vans are entering our cities. At a certain moment, we invested within SI2 Fund in bubble boost. So that's a last mile delivery with bikes and electrical vehicles. So that's something where we believe it really can be a solution for the congestion and health problematic in the cities. The biggest supplier of SI2 Fund is an electrical bike produced by a small cooperative, a startup in Ghent. It's the Opportunity Factory. They produce some electrical bike. In fact, 3 years before we invested in Bubble Post, we already invested with our seed capital fund in the Opportunity Factory. If you look at the biggest client of Bubble Post, seems to be SmartMat. And SmartMat is having boxes with food prepared with organic, locally food and distributed in cities. This is the biggest client for Bubble Post. In fact, Coris, our family holding, invested in SmartMat because we believe these are solutions for some issues within cities and growing markets also. In fact, SmartMat is working together with Collect and Go. Collect and Go is a place where, to the supermarkets of over 200 places where you can get your food boxes also maybe. So they are working on a project also, how can we connect people, older people with an app. Maybe I go every Saturday to the supermarket, maybe I can get some products also for my older neighbors. So trying to connect these all. So what I wanted to say is, as an impact investor, there are many opportunities to invest in solutions. But the point I wanted to make is, I always say we invest, but these are different puzzles of the pieces of the puzzle. So investing in a startup is not the same as investing in Collect and Go. It's a really different kind of capital also needed. So it's not up to bank to give loans at 8 or 10% to a starting social entrepreneur. Maybe there is an incubator needed or crowdfunding needed. So different kinds of impact investing possibilities are there, and we have to take the risk. So only have the benefits, and there are nice examples of social enterprises having a return of 25% and doing very well, but these are the exceptions. So you have to take some risk and maybe accept or a higher risk or a lower return.
Thank you. So, I mean, you echo themes components that you also touched on, Tom, in terms of this risk-taking and the creativity that's required. It's very non-straightforward, but as you say, build the environment and change the mindset. I like this expression, and that you can do good and do well. There can be that win-win situation, but it requires some balls, and it requires taking a risk, and it requires being creative to find solutions. So let's just park that there. I would really like to give you an opportunity. Do not be silent. Come on, these are guys with fabulous brains and experience, and they've come here to this vast place to address you. Are you sure you do not wish? I'm looking out, squinting into the light. No? You need another coffee before you ask. Okay, so I will just come back. I mean, one important thing, I mean, I'm very interested in what you said again about these self-creating groups. So you're not just sort of parking it in one area saying, right, there's sort of, here's housing, and we're going to use that in building in a very different way and make sure that from the front it looks like that and it's non-stigmatized. There are so many different aspects to this. It's like a big snowball that gathers momentum. Coming back to my point earlier, you've got different population groups, different kinds of groups, some of them often very vulnerable, some of them who don't feel they can speak up in the same building. You said about, do you find that obviously these self-management groups, they are very, very important in order to avoid management problems in the future? Because there is a risk, isn't there, somewhere along the line? So what have you found to be the experience thus far in putting all these different kinds of groups with all their different needs and demands in the same place?
I think first I have to explain with regard to one physical feature. Usually we do not mix, so to say, when we have one entrance into a house, mix different types of users. So one entrance, one type of housing. So that is, so to say, creating, so to say, a protected space with regard to self-perspective and identity, but also to a certain degree reducing conflicts and, so to say, living next door. Yeah. So nevertheless, mixing different types of actors, people in different buildings, and I could just continue with your argument. We are doing a lot of co-living concepts of different types in Harvard City at the present moment. I think is an important element to use proximity as a starting point to create a community. And the community partly creates itself because people meet, because we are bringing together developers and, for example, social institutions and the different types of social institutions, 20 in Harvard City, dealing with housing, very specific housing types, organize themselves and come up with new ideas which cross-fertilize in the existing urban environment already to build up new institutional backgrounds. And people developing visions of Harvard City write papers to me and say, well, Jürgen, when you continue, you have to think better about old age housing because we will become old. So we are forced also in a learning organization, and by organizing themselves, they become an active network of people working together, supporting the development again. So it's a multifaceted, so to say, development process, because you're not building at one point in time, but it's actually 15, 20 years of networking, building institutions and network structures. And when the decision was made, after 3,000 people were there, to bring in 750 refugees, because we still had place, you know, journalists were expecting, you know, a great headline for the local newspaper. The rich people of Hartford City against refugees. Yeah? And then there was a public meeting I directed, and it was very smooth because the people said, we think it is necessary and we are in a position to help. So it was, so to say, part of their self-esteem to have, so to say, also a community role to play. And that does not exist per se, but it is also part of a learning process. And some of the journalists were very disappointed they could go home, and it's now working very well. We had no conflicts up to now, but maybe I must confess the reason is it is a temporary solution for 3 or 4 years, then they will be integrated into normal housing schemes. But nevertheless, so to say, the stress test shows that the community structure is to a certain degree socially resilient.
And those stress tests are very important because, again, it's as we spoke earlier, it's about examples, examples, examples. If you've got to convince the people who hold the purse strings, if you've got to convince the politicians and other key stakeholders to think otherwise, then you need that. Just to come back to you, if I may, Serge, on something that I think it was Marnix who said it was the 1970s when it sort of started all this segregation and you know, very much, well, certainly if I think about the UK in terms of social class, you know, the money, the not moneyed, and that very sort of that very precise class system. But what you are bringing up in what you said in your opening, I mean, we've got the demographic challenge, you know, we've got that. We've got shopping centres. It's not just important to meet because we live in an age where we are consuming more than ever. So that is, in a sense, it's another way of looking at that consumption and making something positive out of that, these common areas. You talk about loneliness. Do you therefore see, in terms of the segregation and how, when we talk about social inclusion, that that's really changed over the last few decades? Because we're not just talking about class, we're talking about all sorts of other things. We're talking about migrants, we're talking about different ethnic minorities, we're talking about age in the vulnerable, there's much more focus on perhaps the disabled. So would we say social inclusion it's much more complex because of the societal challenges we face and because of those challenges are so concentrated in cities? Do you see that the issue has become more pressing and more complicated?
Well, I wish I could answer to you just yes. Yes, I think I would just add one dimension. It is the cosmopolitan nature also of our population, which is also breaking a number of social circles. I told you about my mother. I have a son who lives in Paris. He doesn't have many friends in Paris. And think about a young Kosovar arriving in Brussels. You know, it's not very easy to find your marks. You can also always give a call to the embassy and see if there is a Kosovar club or a Luxembourg club or a Hungarian club. I have no clue. So that is another reason. And Brussels is an incredibly cosmopolitan city. We would probably we would like to break the image of you know, the Molenbeek Marrakesh and try and get real. A lot better inclusion, so that is another, so the challenges are there, they are met slowly, bits by piece. Not sure that answers your question, but yes, there are, but it is very difficult. I mean, it is very difficult for young people in our environment when we're not really raised in today's environment to care about the elderly. You know, we as developers, we need to, but there are projects. I mean, so we have, and the project that cater to those needs, at the end of the day, for people in the room, they sell well. And
they sell well.
They sell well. So, and it may be very ugly, but that's what we are after, to a certain extent, or to a very large extent.
Sorry, yeah?
No.
And just to say, I mean, just going back to that, you were talking about, less looking after the elderly these days. We're looking at a different society. We're much busier. We're spending more time online building communities than we are face to face. I mean, this aspect of going back to the title of this, these cities where social inclusion is bringing prosperity in the widest sense of the word, and you talked about building the environment changes the mindset. I mean, where are the sticking points in terms of civil society understanding the value of how social inclusion builds cities that are actually beneficial for everybody? Because I think you sum it up very well when you say the media are expecting this face-off, That's how I think when you read the papers, you think that's what it boils down to. If we're talking social inclusion, it's the 750 refugees going in the building, but it's so much bigger than that. So you're financing all sorts of projects that you said that are very varied. So where are the obstacles to thinking about the value of that change and how social inclusiveness is so broad and genuinely beneficial for everybody living in an environment in a city?
One thing I really believe in is that there has always been the social sector, and then there is the business, and then there is the public authorities, and the business had to make money and to look to work for employment, and so to create what is it? Well-being, and then so in fact, I really believe that within these social organizations, social entrepreneurs, those who are the most entrepreneurial, those are really always a bit ahead, and so they have many good examples of having solutions for all these challenges we are facing. But they are always or often very much in a niche, and they are not scaling. So I think if they work together from the other side, from the company side, these companies, the inclusive companies who are really taking care or taking into account every stakeholder, not only the shareholder, but also the employees, also the clients, also the neighbors, also the next generations. There are inclusive companies. If they work together, they can co-create not only these nice niche products, but also really solutions. And so for me, one of the basics is social is the new green. If you look in the green area, in the 90s, those companies who are a bit ahead and not waiting for legislation or some people who saying that you should do this or that. No, they saw it as an opportunity, like Umicore, but also Colruyt Group saw it as an opportunity. If you have less energy consumption, then it will also benefit your client, or you can lower the prices. So these companies in the 90s who are a bit ahead in the green economy, they are the winners today. I think it's the same with the social. Those companies who are really taking into account these social, societal aspects will be the winners in the future.
A last sweep of the audience. Yes, okay. So, was there someone else just before? Because great that you are so... Okay, I'll start with Lisette and then the gentleman behind. Yes, thank you.
Well, actually, a question for all of you. We've heard Tom's story on Pittsburgh. We know the European cities are very differently governed. We have a very different history. But what are your takeaways? What can we do, learning from the Pittsburgh story, for our European cities, and maybe Brussels and Antwerp as the key examples?
Yeah.
For me, the idea of intentionality with a strong long-term vision of the public authority saying, okay, that's the way we want to go in the long term, and then trying to co-create between private sector, social organizations. This is really the way to go. And so also investing in education in the long term as a profit. Within our fund, as I2 fund, we use a methodology SROI, so social return on investment. Every euro you put in it, what's the benefit for the society. And you can calculate it, and sometimes it's 3. So €1 invested can have a benefit of 3 for the society. Maybe only 80 cents for the investor, and then you lose money, and then it's not sustainable. But then you have something to go to public authority and say, maybe if you give 50-cent subsidies, it becomes sustainable. And then it's also a win for the society, not 3, but 2.5 they win. So this idea of trying to make new innovative constructions together with public authority with a long-term vision and for the good of all, that's the way to go.
Thank you. And what are the key components that you took?
We need to break the wall. I mean, there is a huge wall between public authorities and private enterprises. You know, some public servants call me devil, saying you're the private sector. We don't talk to the devil. I think if, on the other hand, we are complaining, and we, as private sector, we're complaining a lot too much. Who is not? Raise your hand who says, I don't like the center of Brussels, this is shit, it stinks, it is dangerous. So you all find it nice? No, you don't. No, you don't. But how can we sit with UPC, with ULI together, the investors and the developers, to try and come up with an agenda for Yvon Mayer or for all the public authorities? We're actually doing it. So if you want to join UPC and the actors in the center of Brussels, the public authorities today are more than ever starting to listen to what we say if we hold our word. And the private sector has not been holding its word in the past very well. We had a bad reputation. So I think we need to break that wall, and we need to do it quickly. And I would say the challenge is on both sides.
As in most things in life, but I think what you do is you echo, I think when you were giving your example, Tom, about, you were saying it's not just about somebody swaggering in with the cash saying, this is what we think you'll want, we think this will be a win-win for you. It's also about the other side, so it's about both sides, the public and the private sector, figuring out, but not in opposition, where are the values for both and how they can fit and knit together. Yes, yeah.
The private sector wants to make money, and the public sector needs to encourage them to make money. But if we're going to put public money in, we want to know that the deal is not going to happen but for that public money. We don't want to help them make more profit.
But we're delivering tomorrow our 150th school in Flanders. 150. We have 32 to go. But in other parts of the country, some people told me, don't expect to make a single cent with building a school for our region. That was 8 years ago. It is changing, it will change. But in Flanders, 150th school tomorrow morning.
I think that deserves a round. I think it's impressive, no? Well, I do. But I think it's very interesting you keep coming back on this main thing about being prepared to be unpopular, going out there, talking, forums, speaking, moving, listening. I mean, it cannot happen without. A quick response, please, from you on the specific components, again, Tom, that you take away, then the gentleman behind, and I release you for coffee. So, did you want to add what?
I think what John explained was what we have not commented on yet is actually the city took the entrepreneurial role not only in taking up specific projects, but buying up land which actually had no value and produced, so to say, a potential heavy burden. And controlling the land use actually provided the basis, and that was not done by the private entrepreneurs, and it was done by the city to provide a basis for the urban turnaround. The land was available, the derelict sites were in the center, and so actually what he did, in my view, was creating the spatial windows of opportunities and time-wise creating them. So I think that is something which cities can learn in terms of their role. That is something which is not directed at a specific private enterprise, but it is a general role of generating capabilities for cities to make the turnaround. And this question, I think, is an important one. Land can be very fundamental, but also universities, as Tom has shown. What we, with our public universities in Europe, don't do sufficiently, probably because the public universities are less inclined to be entrepreneurial than the private ones. But nevertheless, it is an important element of the strategy within cities to come up with the same solutions Tom actually presented. And then the public-private partnerships, although it may be something which will not work the same way, I think it is a fundamental approach to join strategically, to generate a frame for cooperation. And this frame for cooperation can be strategically developed, not on a one-by-one basis only. So I think the cities have not to be afraid, but also the private ones should not also be afraid.
Okay, thank you. To grab the future, as Buzz Lightyear would say. Yes, last, very nice and concise, please, because I think people need caffeine. Yes.
Yeah, this is a question for Tom and Jürgen. We talked about the challenges of social inclusion, and of course, integrating people of different social backgrounds and age is challenging, but the biggest challenge, I believe, is integrating people from different ethnic and religious backgrounds. Now, if you take the example of Singapore, they've had a very forceful policy. In social housing projects, they allocate housing according to the ethnic and religious composition of the whole country, proportionately, in order to avoid ghettos. Is that an issue and a challenge that you've faced in Hamburg and in Pittsburgh? And if yes, is Singapore an inspiration, or have you had other approaches?
Okay, a nice, concise, yeah. Thank you.
The Singapore situation is working extremely well because 90% of the housing is public housing. And therefore, the public housing agency in Singapore can basically play that role that in an apartment there's either Chinese, Indian, or another type of household, and you cannot simply move around free, so they are spatially allocated if you are looking for a new housing place. So basically, in Hamburg, we have 120,000 housing units in the public sector. We have something where the public housing company tries to allocate by preventing segregation, also on, so to say, racial terms, in their housing estates. That works to a very significant degree, very fine. But due to the fact that we have almost 85% non-public housing, there is no instrument to achieve what you basically requested. So it is a self-organization process, and we see naturally racial clustering within our European cities based on private ownership. And that is something we cannot simply transfer from Singapore, but we could look into it, whether the public sector, but also the corporate sector, could stronger contribute to a mixture of, so to say, ethnic backgrounds in our cities.
Okay. Tom, nice, and did you want to add something, just very, very short to that?
Of course, Pittsburgh still has low-income neighborhoods or ghettos, poor areas of the city. We spent a lot of time focusing on a number of those. And again, it is about a vision and a strategy, and then how we entice the private sector to invest in those neighborhoods. Interestingly, one of the first things that we would do in a poor neighborhood that we would invest in is a library. And we would put the library on the worst drug corner. Why do we do that? Because the library attracts people that are interested in different things. And libraries are not just a place to borrow books. They are also places that people access computers and go to classes. And we use that to begin the redevelopment of an area. And then we'll do housing and retail. And we will, again, all of it is partnerships with the private sector. So in some cases, we would have very deep subsidies to entice a private developer to participate. Those subsidies are always in the form of patient money loans. We would never do grants. We might lose that money because we're not going to, the developer's going to receive the return, but we're betting that we can make this neighborhood work. So there's that high level of risk, and so in one neighborhood we might provide $10,000 of subsidy per unit, and in another neighborhood we might provide $40,000 of unit. It would depend on the market in the development.
Okay. Thank you very much. I did deliberately run over because we've started 15 minutes late, and I wanted to give these guys who've come all this way a chance to entertain you with their thoughts and their expertise. So a break now for coffee for 25 minutes until 11:30, and then we've got another great speaker, fellow female, coming up onto the stage, and then we've got a chat with two mayors to conclude before lunch. So stretch, tweet, have good conversations. See you at 11:30. Thank you very much.